Hey folks, Damien from Southpaw Designs, and one of the most common requests that I get on this channel is how do you take a CNC project from design in your software all the way through to completion. So that's what we're going to do today. I was recently asked to create a memorial plaque for a person who worked there for over 30 years. Fort Herod is in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, which is where I grew up. So it was an incredible honor for them to ask me to do that. So we're going to dig right in and see how that was created. So let's jump right in. If you're not interested in seeing the design part in VCarve Pro, which is only about a minute or so, you can look down on the chapter markers and jump right past that. Remember that any tools that I use will be linked down in the description below if you're interested in checking any of those out. So let's dig right in. So our first task is to design everything in VCarve Pro. I've already laid out the text like I want. I'm using a font called Rapier at the top. Now you'll notice right here when I go into my cam settings, I'm going to use a 60-degree V-bit with a 1/4 inch shaft right there. You'll see that's the one that we choose. I don't need to change any other settings. And for the profile, which is simply the outline that I'd like to have on it, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to have a flat cut depth on that because since that is actually seen as a box, I just want to do an outline and I don't want to take a risk on going too deep. Once we have all that finished, let's just preview the tool paths and get an idea of what it'll look like. There we are. I love it. And once we're done there, we just simply need to save our file. Now, I'm going to save these both to one file since they are using the same bit, even though they're two different tool paths. There is no tool change, so I can just save it to one file. And now we're off and running. First step is to take this cherry wood that I'm actually going to use through my planer. And this DeWalt planer, if I could go back, I would have bought the 735 instead of the 734, but it does the job. Next, let's joint this wood up. Now, I don't have a jointer right now, so I'm just simply using a jointer slit, which for my purposes works just fine. Then we'll complete our glue up, which if you've watched any woodworking videos, you've probably seen this before. Finish that up, tighten it down. I like using these pipe clamps. They serve me well. Put coals on the end to make sure it stays nice and flat. And let it dry. Once it's dried and we have it out of the clamps, I just like to use 60 grit sandpaper to get rid of any residual glue, and then also to get it nice and flat. Now I've already sanded it to a 120 grit, so I'm going to raise the grain just by putting some water on there. And then I'm going to sand to a 220 grit, which gives it a nice buttery finish. From there, let's move over to the CNC. Now, for my purposes, I really only need to set the Z-axis right here. I've eyeballed the X and Y. Put on some Aura Mask, which if you're going to be painting your product, Aura Mask is a great way to do that. Once we get it on there, get any bubbles out, I have this simple little roller that I like to use to get any last minute bubbles out of there and get it as flat as we can. I'll put a link down in the description below. Once we've got any bubbles out, then it's on to cutting. Again, this is a 60-degree V-bit. I'm not going to show you the entire process. You get the idea, although it is kind of therapeutic to sit there and watch a CNC run. Once it's done with the Rapier font, we're going to move down to the bigger text. And while the CNC is running, now we're going to go back and we are going to create our frame. I'm going to use this piece of walnut right here to frame everything up. The handy thing about a CNC is that while you're actually doing your work, the CNC is doing its work. So it's like having an extra pair of hands. I've seen some people say they don't really like CNC work, but it served me well, and I've made some great projects that I'm very happy with. Use the table saw to cut down our frame, then move over to the miter saw to create our miters. Once the CNC is done with its work, I'm going to spray it off, get off as much of that dust as we can. And I want to tape up a couple of those edges that the Aura mask didn't catch. And I'm actually going to paint it right here on my CNC. Just going to use some black spray paint. Now, one thing you have to be careful of while you're painting is make sure that you've gotten any burrs of that Aura mask off there. And if there are any pieces that have come loose, try to tighten those back down. You can always sand off if you accidentally paint anywhere you shouldn't have. But the better of a job you do of sealing that Aura mask down, the less you're going to have to go back and clean up at the end. Once everything's dried, and you do want to give it time to dry, let's remove it from the CNC, and then let's start peeling that stuff away. Now, getting the big stuff is easy, but it's getting between those letters, inside the A's and the E's and the P's and the O's. That stuff takes a little while. And again, you always want to make sure you wait until this dries before you start pulling it off. There's less of a chance of you having any dust that's going to go down into the letters and get stuck. And that's also going to prevent any smudging and smearing. As you can see right there on the left-hand side, a little bit of paint got through, but nothing that a little sandpaper won't clean up. Once we have the big pieces, then we move on to the fine points. I just have a marking knife that I typically use to clean these up. This probably takes longer than just about anything else, because you've got to get inside each one of those letters. And unfortunately, the Aura mask sometimes starts to pull away, and so you have a little bit of paint that you have to get rid of, but it did a good job there. Now, because I didn't cut it accurately to size before, I'm going to go back with my track saw and cut off the edges so I can square it up. I should have actually done that before I put it on the CNC, but no big deal. I actually kind of like to do it this way because that way I can screw down the material onto my CNC and not have to worry about other types of clamps. I like the screw down method. It works for me. And from there, let's take off the tape that I put on there. Put this extra tape on while I was cutting it to make sure I didn't actually scuff anything up. I'd hate to ruin this at this point. And it looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and put the finishing touches on there. I have this Bessie strap clamp, which is commonly used for frames, and I really like this. It's a handy tool to have. If you don't have one, I'd recommend you get one. Again, I've got a link down in the description. I'm going to do a simple little glue up. Now, miters could have been a little bit better, but they're not bad. They're acceptable. Assemble everything together. And once we have it lined up, let's use that strap clamp and tighten everything down and then let it dry. Once we leave it to dry, then I'm going to flip it over and you get to see my big old head. But once it gets out of the way, you'll notice I'm using my trim router and a keyhole bit to put the mount in the back. Then let's just clean out any of that extra sawdust there. Once we've gotten that, we can flip it over and apply some lacquer, and we are done. Not bad if I do say so myself, and hopefully a fitting tribute to Mr. Moore.